Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's event. My name is Xin Sun. I'm a senior lecturer in Chinese and East Asian business at Law China Institute, King's College, London. And I will be chairing this event, which is the first event for our China Week. China Week, is an annual week-long event series talking about contemporary Chinese issues from different perspectives and aiming to promote understanding on China through public engagement and research. The theme of this year entitled, you no longer see that from the screen, whether the China model, the economic, developmental, and the social challenges facing China today, obviously focuses on the economy, which I'm sure everybody gets interested, super interested, given the dramatic stock market movement we are seeing over the past 2 weeks, and also the rapid changes in China's economic situation over the past few years. I think on this topic, nobody understands better than our speaker today. So now let me exercise my honor to introduce the keynote speaker. We have Professor Michael Pettis on the other side of the screen. Michael Pettis is a Beijing-based senior fellow at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He has been teaching finance at Beijing University since 2004. He has also taught at Tsinghua University and Columbia University. Prior to moving to China in 2002, Professor Pettis spent 15 years on Wall Street, where he ran trading and capital markets, focusing on Latin America. He has published 6 books, the most recent of which, Trade Wars Are Class Wars, from Yale University Press. It was the 2021 Lionel Gelber Book Prize winner. So before I hand over to Professor Pettis, let me just say one more thing. Over my whole career, I have learned tremendously from the deep insights Professor Pettis have on Chinese economy. And whenever I have puzzles regarding China's economic policies and the changing situations, I come to his books, publications, and even tweets to find answers, which are always extremely satisfying. So now I would like to invite everyone to join me to welcome Professor Pettis. And Michael, our floor is yours. Just a reminder that you may have to speak a little bit loudly because the volume here is a little bit low. Okay.
Okay. Shall I start now? And can you hear me well? Thanks very much, Shinsun, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be speaking to this group. The topic of my conversation is something that I think we're going to be speaking a lot more about in the next 2 to 3 years, and that is, why is it so hard to boost the consumption share of China's GDP? Before I start on that, I want to step back a little bit and give a bit of a historical overview on the Chinese growth model, which, by the way, wasn't invented by China. Many countries have followed this sort of high savings, high investment model. And it's been very successful in the past. But in every case that I can find, it went from a period of very rapid, healthy growth to a period of very rapid, unhealthy growth driven by a surge in the debt burden, and then finally followed by a usually quite difficult adjustment. And I would like to sort of discuss why that's the case and why the adjustment has always been so difficult. So the way this model works is that in countries that are severely underinvested, most developing countries, but also countries that have been destroyed by war, or countries like China during the reform and opening up, that had gone through 5 decades of anti-Japanese wars, civil war, and Maoism. And they start off the process with much less investment than they can productively absorb. So in the case of China, as I'm sure you all know, by the end of the 1970s, China had a terrible transportation system, very poor ports, a minimum number of airports, very few subways. I think there was one subway in Beijing, and I'm not even sure of that. and very poor manufacturing facilities, et cetera, et cetera. So what China needed was to invest in a full range of things and to invest as quickly as possible to bring up its investment, which in turn would drive growth in the economy. This was all productive investment. Now, here I always stop and make a mention of one of my favorite economists, Albert Hirschman. And Hirschman, I think, is not as well known among economists as he should be. Hirschman spent much of his career working on developing countries, particularly in Latin America, but also in some other parts of the world. And one of the insights Hirschman made that I think is especially profound is that Hirschman argued that a successful growth model, by definition, makes itself obsolete. So that's the first point. And that makes sense. A successful growth model is one that addresses your particular problems, your particular institutions, and resolves them. That's what it means to be successful. But once those problems have been resolved, the model is no longer an appropriate model. And if it's continued, it tends to develop other sorts of imbalances. The second point that Hirschman made was that most countries, and this is true of every country I can find that followed this high savings and high investment model, most countries, when they reach the end of the shelf life of that successful growth model, fail to adjust. It takes them a long time to adjust. Now, part of the reason may be that it takes a few years to recognize that what was once a winning strategy is no longer a winning strategy. But the problem is that the reluctance or the inability or the refusal to change lasted much, much longer, usually decades. And Hirschman was very puzzled as to why. And he said, so one possibility, of course, is that policymakers are just dumb and don't realize what they need to do. That's not a very satisfying answer. The answer that he proposed is that a successful growth model is very unbalanced. And in fact, the more rapid the growth, the more unbalanced the model tends to be. And those imbalances tend to benefit certain constituencies within the economy disproportionately. So in the case of China, China was growing by 10 or 11% for 20 years, but that growth was very unevenly distributed. Certain sectors of the economy grew much more quickly, investment in infrastructure, the property sector, manufacturing, and certain sectors of the economy, primarily the household sector, grew much more slowly. And what Hirschman argued was that the constituencies that benefit disproportionately create institutions that take advantage of that unbalanced model and then become very resistant towards the unwinding or reversal of those institutions. So he argued that the inability to adjust was not so much an economic problem as a problem of institutions, a political problem. Now, Hirschman wasn't talking about China. He died before China became the story that it became, but he might as well have been. It's a very powerful way of thinking about what happened in China. And so to describe the growth model, in the 1980s, consumption in China as a share of GDP was fairly normal. It was sort of at the middle of what was the case in most developing countries. But over the next 10 to 20 years, the consumption share of GDP dropped at first to very low levels by the end of the 1990s, and then in the next 10 to 11 years to totally surreal levels, levels that we've never before seen in history. Now, is this a bad thing or a good thing? Well, it depends on your specific set of conditions. As you know, low consumption is just a way of saying high savings because GDP is either consumed or not consumed, which we call savings. And so when you consume a very low share, you save a very high share. So is high savings a good thing or a bad thing? And it turns out that if you have extremely high investment needs, then high domestic savings is the best way to fund those needs. Before the 1960s and 70s, the standard developing country model was to invest savings from abroad, right? And the classic case was the United States in the 19th century, which ran deficits almost every year of the century until the very end, until the last decade. And those deficits were financed by capital inflows, the importation of foreign savings from Europe, mostly the UK and the Netherlands. Now, this has been a very successful model, but it creates certain problems. For one thing, if foreigners are unwilling to export enough savings to fit your full investment needs, then you grow more slowly than you otherwise might. And secondly, any disruption in the capital exporting country can become a big problem in the capital importing country. So every time England had a financial crisis, it seemed like the US had a worse financial crisis. So funding these high investment needs from domestic savings seems like a good thing. But it means, of course, that consumption is going to be very low. That's simply another way of saying savings are very high. So how did China force up the savings rate? It forced it up the same way many other countries did. So, for example, you'll notice that in Europe, German savings were relatively low before the 2003-2004 labor reforms. German savings was less than German investment. Germany was a net importer of capital and ran trade deficits. After that period, German savings soared, and Germany ended up becoming the biggest trade surplus country in the world because savings vastly exceeded domestic savings. So what did Germany do? You know, if you read the press in 2009, 2010 during the crisis, it's pretty clear what Germans did. Germans exercised their historical thriftiness. They all started saving lots of money and working very hard. But that, of course, is nonsense. It's not what happened. What happened with the labor reforms is that there was a huge transfer of income from workers to businesses. In other words, if you look at Germany before 2003, GDP growth, I wish I had two hands, it would be easier, but I broke a bone in my right hand. But GDP growth was roughly the same pace as wage growth. Wages grew as quickly as GDP, so that's theoretically correct. Wages should grow in line with productivity. But after the labor reforms, wage growth slowed significantly, and GDP growth slowed a little bit. So we started to see a gap between GDP growth and wage growth. And that gap was matched by a surge in business profits. So the way you can think about the reforms was they basically transferred income from workers to businesses. Now that has a big impact on savings because businesses technically save all of their income. They don't consume. Workers consume most of their income. So if you transfer income from ordinary people to the rich or from ordinary people to businesses, you tend to get an automatic increase in the savings rate and an automatic decrease in the consumption rate. And something very similar happened to China, but it's important to understand what these mechanisms were because they're the very same mechanisms that make it so hard to reverse the process. So one of the most powerful mechanisms was the distribution of credit in the 1990s and 2000s. And even today, China operates under what the Japanese in the 1980s used to call window guidance. Credit isn't determined by the market. Credit is basically determined by the regulators, and it's directed into specific parts of the economy. Very little of it was directed towards the household sector until about 10 years ago, when household debt surged. But before that, it was all directed to the producing sector, to local governments, to SOEs, and to businesses. And here's the thing, it was directed at very low interest rates. In fact, in the 2000s, interest rates were seriously negative in real terms, right? So as an aside, that explains why the private sector was so successful. If you can borrow unlimited amounts of money at a negative real interest rate, it's very hard for you not to be successful. But at any rate, why do low interest rates matter? Because when you are artificially lower interest rates, you're simply transferring income, right? You're transferring income from net lenders to net borrowers. Who are the net lenders as a sector? Well, clearly the household sector, right? Because they save money in the banking system. And who are the borrowers? In China, the borrowers were, again, local governments, SOEs, and businesses. So there was this big transfer. And in the 2000s, it may have been as much as 5% of GDP every year transferred simply through very low interest rates, right? Now, what does this transfer do? Well, it subsidizes the producing sector, but it suppresses the growth of income of the household sector. So you push up GDP growth while constraining household income growth. So that's part of the way you get this gap between the growth in GDP and the growth in household income. There are other mechanisms that do the same thing. Tariffs do that. Tariffs are one of those things that always generate an hysterical response. Either they're, always wrong in the spawn of Satan, or they're always a good thing. But in fact, tariffs are simply one of the ways of transferring income. When you raise tariffs, you transfer income from net importers to net exporters. Which sector is a net importer? Well, the household sector. All households except subsistence farmers are net importers. Which sectors are the net exporters? The producing sectors. So once again, you're transferring income from the household sector to subsidize production. By the way, that's exactly how depreciation works. When you have an undervalued currency, you're simply transferring from net importers, the household sector, to net exporters, the manufacturing and producing sector. There are other such mechanisms. Most of you know about the hukou system. The hukou system is, among other things, it's a way of reducing the income of migrant workers. They don't have the same legal standing in worker disputes, and they're not able to get Social Security benefits until they return to the place of their hukou. So in many cases, it simply wasn't worth doing it. You should think of the hukou as a kind of transfer, a transfer from migrant workers to the rest of the economy. So once again, it subsidizes economic growth while it suppresses the growth in household income. One of the most important of these transfers in the last 10 years has been infrastructure spending. And this, a lot of economists don't really understand, because in the West, investment tends to be productive because of hard budget constraints. But it's possible, as Japan showed us in the 1980s, to invest non-productively on a massive scale, the famous bridges to nowhere, and many other things. Now, why is that a transfer? Because when you build, say, a bridge, you spend $100 to build the bridge, and it generates only $80 of value to the economy, including all of the externalities, right? There is a loss for the economy. And that loss is broadly shared by the whole economy. But very often, the point of that infrastructure is to support manufacturing, logistics, transportation, things like that. So in a way, it's a transfer from the country as a whole, which includes the household sector, to the manufacturing and producing side of the economy. Some people find that hard to explain, and the example that I use, for example, in my class, is during the Winter Olympics, Beijing built a beautiful high-speed train to a village in the north for where much of the Olympic Games were held. Now, clearly they did this for political symbolism, et cetera, et cetera. We always tend to overspend on the Olympics. But seen from a purely economic point of view, this probably made no sense. The train was very expensive. It's a beautiful train. And it's something that's not going to be used much of the year. It's used basically in the winter by people who ski. So the way I think about that train is that it's a huge gift from the people of China to people like me, people who live in Beijing who like to ski. So we're better off, but the country overall isn't better off. So when you think of it that way, it's a transfer from the country overall to the specific sectors that benefit most from this very high quality logistical infrastructure. So you have all of these mechanisms that lock in these transfers. And as they do so, imagine what happens institutionally. Most of the transfers end up benefiting local governments, particularly the financial transfers, but a number of others, surging real estate prices, et cetera, et cetera. And over 30 to 40 years, you build a set of institutions around those transfers. And those institutions are what the political elite, the business elite, the financial elite, all sort of structure their role in the economy around, right? This is an important issue. So as a result, it's very hard to reverse those transfers. So the problem that China is facing, and I would say it's been facing this basically since around 2008, 2010, is that it is massively over-investing in property, in infrastructure, which I think is a bigger problem than property, and now increasingly in the manufacturing sector. So it needs to bring investment down, right? And I think in 2010, I think almost everyone disagreed, but today I think almost everyone agrees. By the way, why do I say 2010? There's a very simple measure, and we've seen it in all the countries that followed this growth model. It's particularly apparent in countries in which credit is directed to the producing side of the economy. And the simple way of thinking about it is that if I take $100 of resources, which perhaps I pay for in the form of borrowing, and convert it into $110 worth of resources, a productive investment, we're all better off. And then there are issues about how that excess is distributed within the economy. But the problem is if I borrow $100 and use $100 of resources to build the bridge, that only creates $80 worth of value for the economy. That's almost by definition a non-productive investment. How does that matter to debt? Well, in the former case, you could see a rapid growth in debt, but debt would never be an issue because you would see an even more rapid growth in GDP. So the debt burden would always stay very low. This happened in Brazil in the 50s and 60s, in the Soviet Union, in a whole bunch of countries, in Japan up until the early 1980s. Debt grew very quickly, but we never talked about it because the debt burden never seemed to get worse. And I remember back in the early 2010s when I talked about a structural debt problem in China, the standard response was China doesn't have a debt problem, and it will never have a debt problem if you understand Chinese culture, because Chinese culture is anti-debt. Again, total nonsense, but you often get those sort of silly cultural arguments. But it was already clear then, around 2007, 2008, where you started to see the acceleration in credit growth and the deceleration in GDP growth. Again, I want to stress, that shouldn't happen if most debt is used to fund the production side of the economy and investment is productive. You shouldn't see that gap, and that's when it started to happen. But for a long time, it was ignored, and people said things like debt will never be a problem in China. But that changed in the last few years, particularly last year when we saw Guizhou early in, I think it was in January, it may have been a little bit later, when Guizhou basically announced that it was bankrupt. They didn't say they were bankrupt, but they said we can't service our debt unless we get help, which means you're bankrupt. And then that was followed by a whole series of similar announcements from other provinces. That was a formal recognition of what many economists were starting to suspect, that there was a real debt problem, particularly at the local government level. And this problem was associated with infrastructure investment. I would say particularly this year, when at the beginning of the year, we saw Beijing close down a whole bunch of infrastructure projects, even ones that had already been started. So there is a recognition that investment levels are too high. And by the way, maybe, to shock my audience, let me explain what I mean by too high. Globally, investment is about 25% of GDP. So by definition, consumption is 75% of GDP. But not every country is the same. Advanced economies that already have high investment levels tend to invest well below average, around 18 to 20%. Badly managed developing countries also have low investment levels of around that same range. Rapidly growing developing countries with high investment levels typically tend to invest 30 to 34% of GDP. China has been investing over 40%, which I think we've never seen before, for something like 30 years. It currently invests about 43%. Not so long ago, it invested around 47% of its GDP, almost twice the global average. If you reduce the consumption, if you reduce the investment share of China's GDP by 10 full percentage points, it will still be one of the highest investing countries in the world. So that gives you an idea of just how extraordinarily dependent it is on the growth of investment. But here's the problem. Consumption growth is broadly equal to the growth, GDP growth is broadly equal to the growth in consumption and the growth in investment. Technically also the growth in the trade surplus, but that's quite small, so we can ignore it. If you bring investment growth down rapidly in order to reduce the amount of non-productive investment and reduce the astonishing surge in debt, then one of two things must happen. Either GDP growth must drop substantially, or you must somehow get consumption growth to rise substantially. So where we've reached in the last 3 years, where the consensus, at least among economic policy advisors and prominent economists in China, I don't know what the policymakers are thinking. It's very hard to talk to them. But at least among the economic ecosystem, there is a widespread recognition that you've got to bring investment down. And the only way you can do that without a sharp slowdown in GDP growth is with a surge in investment. So why not increase, with a surge in consumption? I apologize. I've been traveling and I'm a little jet lagged. So why not simply increase consumption? Aren't people happy when you give them more money to consume? Well, there's two ways you can increase consumption, right? One way is convince Chinese households to save less. In that case, automatically they consume more. The problem there is that if Chinese are saving because of a great deal of uncertainty about the economy, and if the economy is uncertain because of the difficulty of raising consumption, it's not clear that we can do that. We may have the causality running backwards. It may require an increase in consumption to get Chinese households to feel secure enough to start reducing their savings rate. Another way, which is very similar, it's just the obverse, is increased household debt, right? Debt is just negative savings. So increasing household debt is the same thing as reducing household savings from a macro point of view. That's also very hard, partly because Beijing doesn't want to increase household debt. Household debt increased so rapidly when they finally opened it up in the last decade that Chinese households had more debt relative to income than even American households. And so now they're trying to bring it down. In addition, given the collapse in the real estate market and the nervousness among Chinese workers, people are more eager to pay down debt than to take out new debt. You can always get household debt to go up. There are always people willing to borrow. And if you lower your lending standards enough, you can get household debt to go up. But that just creates future problems in the banking system. So that's very hard to do. Another way of doing it, which is the way we're all talking about, is have the government borrow money, and instead of stimulating the supply side of the economy, have them distribute it to households directly or indirectly so that they consume more. And that's where the discussion has reached. This is something some of us have been talking about for a long time. Supply side stimulus is basically not a waste, but it's bad for the economy. That should be shifted to demand side stimulus. And they haven't done it. And there's lots of speculation as to why they haven't done it. One group says that it's because it violates Xi Jinping's deepest beliefs and he'll never do it. He hates welfareism. I'm not sure I buy that argument, but at any rate, they haven't done it. But now increasingly, it looks like that's what they're going to do. In fact, on Saturday, we were all expecting a concrete proposal of 1 trillion of borrowing to subsidize the consumption part of the economy. It didn't happen, but I think it's going to happen. And I think many people believe it's going to happen. Tang Tai, who wrote a piece, and if you're interested, if you go to my Twitter account, I link to it, in which he said it shouldn't be 1 trillion, it should be 10 trillion. And even that's on the small side. I think he's right. But you need a massive amount of borrowing directed, and he said, to the consumption side of the economy, not to the supply side of the economy. And in that case, we'll see a surge in consumption. There'll be a positive multiplier because Chinese businesses are not investing. And if you ask them why they're not investing, they'll tell you there's no demand. So if you can boost consumption, presumably some Chinese businesses will invest more. And so you get a positive multiplier, you get good growth. The problem is, and I don't think the discussion in China is there yet, is that while this is a good short-term response, it doesn't solve the fundamental problem. And the fundamental problem is that the Chinese economy is structured in such a way that households get a disproportionately low share of everything that's produced. So you can borrow and distribute income to the household sector, but that means you can only keep growing as long as you have debt capacity. You need infinite debt capacity to do this forever. Chinese debt levels are already extraordinarily high. China has had the fastest growth in debt burden, I think, that we've ever seen in history. So that's a way to solve the next 3 months, the next 6 months, maybe even the next year or two, but it's not a permanent solution. The permanent solution is to restructure the economy. But here's the problem, and I don't think we're discussing this enough, although I believe in the next 2 to 3 years, this is where the center of discussion is going to move. The problem is that you've built the economy and you've built a whole series of elite financial, political, and business institutions around a particular distribution of income. And if you reverse them, you're causing a lot of disruption to the economy. And here I always make a reference to Japan. You know, in 1980, Japan had very similar problems that China had, except not nearly to the same extent. And in 1986, Japan issued the very famous Maekawa Commission report, which basically said all the right things. We've got to raise the consumption share of GDP, blah, blah, blah. Great report. You could rewrite it, change all the Japans to China and all the Tokyos to Beijing, and you could almost submit it here in China. But consumption continued declining in Japan until 1991, where it bottomed out. And it took 17 years, 2008, before consumption rose 10 percentage points of GDP. So again, why? Were the Japanese stupid? No, it's structurally very hard to shift the economy. And here's what I would suggest is the problem. So if interest rates are too low, if that's one of the problems, right? It transfers income from net savers, households, to net borrowers, the producing side of the economy, then it's simple, raise interest rates. But as soon as you say that, you immediately know what the problem is. With so much debt and so many over-indebted SOEs and local governments and businesses in China, raising interest rates simply pushes more of them towards bankruptcy. So you do solve the problem, but you solve the problem in the form of a contracting GDP rather than an expanding consumption. And of course, you want to avoid that. So what else could you do? Well, I told you an undervalued currency is a transfer, right? It takes money away from households and subsidizes manufacturers. So raise the value of the currency. Immediately you see the problem. If you do so, China's famous competitiveness becomes undermined. China's competitive not because it's particularly efficient, but because if you have an undervalued currency, low wage growth, very cheap financing, of course you're going to be very competitive. Great infrastructure, et cetera. So if you reverse that, you undermine the competitiveness of the Chinese manufacturing sector. Raise wages, right? Simple solution. Same problem. You undermine the competitiveness of the manufacturing sector. And here's the part that people often forget. Countries that systematically subsidize the manufacturing sector at the expense of the household sector have two characteristics. One is they have extremely high savings rates. So China, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, et cetera. And the other thing is they run as a reflection of those very high rates. It's not the other thing, it's simply a reflection of those very high rates. They all run trade surpluses. And here it's important to remember, a trade surplus isn't a sign that you're an efficient manufacturer. It's a sign that domestic demand is very weak. And that's the problem with this policy. But the other thing about this policy is that, not surprisingly, if you force consumers to subsidize manufacturers, then the manufacturing share of your economy is likely to rise and the consumption share is likely to decline. It's not an accident that if you look at all the advanced manufacturing economies in the world, those that run deficits have lower than average manufacturing shares. So manufacturing is 16% broadly of global GDP. In the US, it's 11%. In the UK, I think it's 9%. In France, it's 10%, et cetera, et cetera. You can go through all of the persistent deficit countries. Canada, I think it's around 10%. And you'll see, not surprisingly, They consume more than their share globally, and they manufacture less than their share globally. And it's the opposite with the economies that run surpluses that subsidize manufacturing. Japan's manufacturing share used to be 27% of GDP. It's now down to 19, still above average, but it came down a bit during that process of rebalancing. It came down a lot during that process of rebalancing. South Korea, Germany, Taiwan, all of them have very high manufacturing shares. In China, manufacturing is roughly 28% of GDP and rising. In other words, manufacturing is bigger than the property sector. It's more important to the economy than the property sector. So when you take steps that undermine manufacturing, you're creating a big risk. You will still adjust. The consumption share of GDP will still go up. But now it might go up not because consumption goes up, but rather because GDP goes down. As you undermine the manufacturing share, they close down, they fire workers, and so you end up with a contraction in GDP. And of course, China wants to avoid that type of adjustment. Many countries have, most famously Japan. Japan adjusted very slowly over 30 years. The consumption share of GDP after 1990, consumption growth rate dropped only a little bit. They managed to keep consumption growing at roughly the same rate, which is why the Japanese people were never, panic-stricken about the terrible adjustment they went through. It was GDP growth that dropped to nearly 0%. So that this very long, slow adjustment, or you could have a rapid adjustment like Brazil in the 1980s, the US in the 1930s, where you have a sharp contraction in GDP and a less sharp contraction in household income. But basically, those are the ways you adjust. But the point that I want to make is that people too often say, why aren't the Chinese boosting consumption? It's so easy. Nobody will complain if you give them more income. Chinese households will be happy if you give them more income. But the point that I want to make is that that requires a structural change in the economy. If my share goes up, by definition, your share must go down. And until we start discussing whose share is going to go down, basically there are three sectors: households, businesses, and government. Whose share is going to go down if the household share goes up? And what is the mechanism for driving down that share? Until we have that discussion, all the talk about boosting consumption is basically one-off increases in consumption generated by borrowing to stimulate the consumption side of the economy. I see that now I'm at 40 minutes. There's a lot more to discuss, but let me stop there and open it up to questions, comments, disagreements.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Pettis, for this excellent, very structured and very rich discussion on China's consumption and debt problems. So we are about to open to the audience for questions, and obviously we are having a full room here, so I'm going to prioritize the audience in the room, but if we still have time left, then we can open some of the questions to people joining online. But before that, Professor Pettis, I want to take advantage of my privilege as a host to ask my first question. So I really like your comparison and analogy with Japan and Germany, saying that these two countries are also having the same kind of economic model that emphasize manufacturing at the expenses of household. But one thing that strikes me as quite surprising is that if you're looking at the inequality level at Germany and Japan, they seem to be very healthy, right? So, well, where you're saying that domestic consumption in these two countries are always weaker compared with the productive forces, but if you look at the inequality, they're around like 30% Gini coefficient. So that strikes me as very puzzling. Well, on the other hand, you see China's inequality is very high, which suggests the demand must be heavily surprised. So how can I understand the very different performance of inequality between China on the one hand and Japan and Germany on the other hand, even if they're adopting the same business model?
The models are never identical. Remember, Germany's buildup was after World War II, and it was basically destroyed by bombing. So it was a very different sort of set of structural issues. But I would say a couple of things. first off, income inequality is one form of distortion in the distribution of income. It's the problem in the United States. It's the problem in a number of Western countries. But in those countries, total household income is roughly 80%, 75% of GDP. So if there is a problem in the distribution of income, the problem exists in income inequality. So for the US to solve its problem, it's got to reduce income inequality. But China has two forms of income inequality. One is income inequality within the household sector. As you pointed out, there's a very high Gini coefficient in China. But China has a second form of income inequality, which is the very high government share of income. So in most countries, households 75, 80% of GDP, businesses roughly 20, 25%, and governments on a net basis are pretty low, right? In China, households retain a much lower share, maybe 60%. It's always hard to calculate these things accurately, but they retain a much lower share. Businesses, again, it's hard to know what's a business and what's a government, but we can say businesses are roughly 20%, and governments, mostly local governments, account for roughly 20% of total income. So China has to solve both the income inequality problem within the household sector and, more importantly, the distribution of total income to households. The second point that I would make is that the Gini coefficient focuses on the income share. But remember that in Japan, to some extent, and particularly in Germany, a lot of rich people, their income is through their ownership of businesses. What's the phrase? The mid-level German companies. So much of their income doesn't show up as income; it shows up as an increase in the value of their companies. And when you look at Germany and Japan from a wealth point of view, you see very high levels of income, very high levels of wealth inequality. And I would argue, because of the structure of ownership, that wealth inequality is a way that income inequality reflects itself. So I would argue that income inequality is a problem in most countries, and we've got to reverse it, because we're in a world that needs more demand, not more savings. But the point that I would make that makes China special is that China has also a different form of income inequality. By the way, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because what it means is that if you want to increase the household share, you have to reduce either the business share or the government share. You probably shouldn't reduce the business share, because you'll undermine the good functioning of the economy. But if you could somehow engineer transfers from the government, mostly local governments, to the household sector, you might presumably get consumption growth rate to perk up, so that you could bring investment down without as rapid a decline in GDP growth. That's never before happened in history, as far as I'm aware. But also, I don't think we've ever seen the conditions historically that we see in China. So at least theoretically, there's a way to rebalance the Chinese economy without a significant slowdown in GDP, and that's by transferring from government to the household sector. As I'm sure you and everyone knows, there have been many proposals in China to do that. They all run into the same set of political difficulties, but if Beijing can resolve that political difficulty, then China can adjust less painfully, say, than Japan did.
Thank you so much, Michael. Once again, that solves my puzzle. So now I want to collect some questions from the audience. Also, by the way, can you introduce yourself to Michael and then ask your question, please?
Thank you so much, Professor Pettis. Roger Kremers from Leiden University in the Netherlands, and not just thanks for the keynote, but for having been a source of inspiration and insight to also my own work for quite a few years. I guess it's sort of present in your book, and it's sort of latently present, but in the keynote today, you have mostly talked about the Chinese economy in isolation. And we are now in a situation also where, and I note you underlining the importance of change, not just recognizing change in the world, but also the change that requires in our theoretical approach and in the Chinese institutional approach. To what extent should we also see this as part of China's changing structural position in the global economy, which comes with its own challenges? And to what extent do these challenges further influence policy perceptions and policymakers in China, also vis-a-vis the economic versus security dichotomy? Thank you very much.
I can't really talk about security issues because I don't have any particular expertise, and it's also a little bit sensitive. But the China faces a problem that Japan really didn't face. There was a lot of complaints about Japan's huge persistent trade surpluses, but as Japan adjusted, you didn't see the same sort of protectionist rhetoric. And one thing I want to point out, a lot of the protectionist rhetoric is sort of designed as anti-China, and I think that's a big mistake. China certainly is one of the countries that are a problem within the global trading system, but the problem is the global trading system itself. That has to change. And this wasn't happening in the 1990s when Japan was going through its adjustment. So as you look at Japan, Japan's current account surplus measured as a share of global GDP, which is what the rest of the world cares about, declined during this period exactly as you would expect. As the consumption share of GDP climbed and as the manufacturing share declined, then Japan's current account surplus should have declined. And so it was a net positive for the world. At the time in 1990, if you had predicted that Japan would grow at 0.5% for the next 20 years, first of all, people would have thrown you out of the room. That was too ridiculous to contemplate. But if they believed you, they would have said that would have been terrible for the global economy because Japan was, quote unquote, the engine of global growth. It wasn't. It was just the largest arithmetical component. What matters to the rest of the world would be the current account surplus, and that contracted. So it's interesting to think what will happen with China. One of the things that I want to stress is that the idea that persistent trade surpluses are a sign of strength is very mistaken. Growing exports are a sign of strength if those exports are converted into imports, because then they improve domestic welfare. Persistent trade surpluses are a sign of weak domestic demand. And that's an additional problem that China faces because I think we are seeing, ever since the 2008 crisis, a major change in the way in which we think about global imbalances and a rising sense that these global imbalances are problematic. For China, they're very necessary because remember, if domestic demand isn't enough to absorb total production, you must run a trade surplus. It's the way of resolving the gap between production and demand. So if we start to see a lot of problems with the US, with Europe, with India, with Japan on the issue of Chinese surpluses, that means that China has to adjust that much more quickly. And I think that would be very difficult. Some people are arguing that China can shift its exports away from those countries towards the developing world. But if the developing world is going to absorb large trade surpluses, it must run large trade deficits. And of course, by definition, those need to be financed. And there's very little evidence that the rest of the world is eager to finance growing deficits in the developing world. So I worry a lot, and as does Beijing. Beijing is very worried about rising confrontations on trade. But I don't think we are anywhere near the end of that process. I expect trade conflict to get worse for many more years before it gets better.
Yeah, the gentleman behind.
Hello, Michael. My name is Conrad Gorski. I'm a Canadian graduate student from Laurentian University. I briefly met you in Washington, D.C. My question is, I've come across many predictions about supply problems with rare earth minerals surfacing in the near future. Many people fear that China will weaponize the supply chain. Do you see such a shortage of rare earth minerals surfacing? And how would it affect China's economic development and international trade more generally?
Well, I'm not really an expert on the subject of rare earths. My understanding is that rare earths are very plentiful. It's the willingness to extract them that is the problem. So in principle, a number of countries, including Canada, can significantly increase the production of various rare metals. My other understanding is that they have a very high value to volume, and so it's quite easy to smuggle. I was told many years ago that if there were restrictions on the export of these metals, a lot of it would be smuggled. But you know, I think there's a tendency to get a little hysterical about China. I don't think it benefits China to put significant constraints. I think it's a very useful threat. But remember, China's problems is that it's got to export. It needs a foreign demand in order to resolve its own demand production gap. So I don't see the Chinese as very, very eager to cut back on vital exports. Who knows? I may be wrong. But my feeling is that we may be a little bit overdoing, the China threat in that aspect.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. That was fascinating. I'm Charlotte Goodburn from the Lao China Institute. I was particularly interested in your overview of a range of different mechanisms that transfer income from households to other sectors of the Chinese economy. And I was curious about your inclusion of hukou system in that list of mechanisms. And you said that the hukou reduces the income of migrant workers, therefore transferring income from migrants to the rest of the economy and suppressing household income. So I'm wondering if you think that abolishing or very substantially reforming the hukou system will be a beneficial thing for the Chinese economy as a whole, in that it would therefore stimulate domestic consumption in a way that I perhaps hadn't thought about before when thinking about the advantages of reforming the hukou system. Thank you.
I'm really glad you brought up the hukou. I should have brought it up myself, because in a way it's sort of a perfect solution, and it shows you what the problem is. So I think there are probably very few people in China, certainly among well-known economists, who don't think the hukou is a problem and who don't think that it should be abolished. And there have been moves to eliminate hukou restrictions, but as the joke in China is, you are now allowed to live anywhere in China as long as you don't want to live there. So I think that shows that in spite of the fact that everyone knows hukou creates distortions in the economy that undermine, the efficiency of monetary policy, fiscal policy, distribution of income, it's very hard to eliminate. Let's assume for a moment, they'll never do this, but let's assume for a moment that tomorrow Beijing announces that the entire hukou system has been disbanded. From now on, anyone can live anywhere he or she likes in China. In the long term, that's probably a good thing. Well, it's certainly a good thing. But in the short term, it could be incredibly disruptive. So, for example, if you live in Shanghai or Beijing or Hangzhou or Shenzhen or any of the top tier cities, these are the cities that are going to receive most of the immigration, and they'll have a choice. Either they have to expand services very dramatically and fund that expansion, or they're going to have to cut back on services to everyone, because now you can no longer treat residents differently from migrants. So it creates a huge short-term adjustment problem. So I think, again, I don't speak to the top leaders, and I don't know what their plan is on hukou, but I think their plan is to gradually abolish it in a non-disruptive way. And that means doing it over many years. And that means what they've done so far is the easy part, abolishing hukou requirements in areas that are not really receiving a lot of migrants anyway. The hard part is to abolish them in areas where people are likely to live. Now, China is such a big country that I'm not sure you can use this comparison, but when you look at other large developing countries, the top 2 or 3 cities, or in some countries like Mexico, the top one city, have such a disproportionate share of the total population that you may wonder what happens in China if you eliminate all travel restrictions. Could you end up getting huge, 3 or 4 enormous cities 2 to 3 times the size of what they are today, perhaps. If you do that quickly, I think everyone would agree that it would be both socially and politically, possibly politically disruptive. So I think it's something that everybody wants. I think it's something that everyone recognizes they have to do very slowly. So it's not going to be a short or medium term solution to the distribution of income. That's my guess. Again, as I say, I don't know what the hukou policy is going to be.
We probably have time for 1 or 2 questions. I guess Yang is next, and probably the, okay, yeah, oh, okay, then we pass to that, no, the gentleman over here. Okay.
Thank you. Tony Han from the BBC. Thank you, Professor Pettis, for sharing your insights in such a concise and accessible way. I really learned a lot. I just wanted to ask for a clarification on this restructuring that you mentioned. So you said that obviously there will be many, many difficulties with pushing through kind of these transfers from the productive side to the consumption side. But what in your view is the principal difficulty, if I can put it in that kind of very simplistic way? Is it a technical question of designing these policies to address this kind of historically unprecedented imbalance? Or is it the kind of political difficulty of overcoming entrenched interests that have developed over the last 30 years?
I'll take the easy way out and say it's both. You know, one of the issues in China is that historically the distributions to the household sector are managed not at the provincial level, but at the municipal level. There really isn't a national institutional system for developing, for delivering income to the household sector. So in the US, in the UK, in Europe, during COVID, it was the national governments that distributed income. But in China, there's no formal mechanism for that. So income has to be distributed from Beijing to the local provincial governments, to the local municipal governments, and then ultimately to the household sector. And, you know, that's easy to say, but if you don't have the institutions that do that, it can be a very messy process. And Tang Tain, in his recent essay, said he completely opposes that because for reasons that he politely refers to as inertia, local governments know how to build, you know, more parking spaces, more bridges. They don't really know how to deliver income to ordinary people. So you have to build up that whole structure. And then the other issue, the more fundamental issue, is that in every country in which we have tried significant redistribution of income, it's been politically quite difficult to do so.
Hey, I think we only have time for the very last question, and I welcome the gentleman over here.
Thank you. Andrew People from the Wire China. Thank you very much, Professor Pettis. I suppose that if a policymaker in Beijing was here, they might say to you, yes, you're right, we accept your diagnosis of the problems in the economy and the imbalances that our system has thrown up over the years. But at the same time, over the years, we've not only this emphasis on investment has built top-class infrastructure throughout China, whether it's trains, buildings, and so on, but the more recent emphasis on manufacturing has enabled us to build up global leading industries such as electric vehicles, green energy, and so on. And what's more, by doubling down on investing in manufacturing, we're now going to build up chip making or artificial intelligence or biotech or whatever it might be. And again, we're going to have leading industries such as those. They'll not only enable us to be secure China's economic future, but that will create enough jobs and enough wealth to keep the population happy, to keep household consumption just high enough for everyone to be content. What would be your comeback to that sort of diagnosis from a policymaker that says, okay, you're right, it's all very imbalanced, it all doesn't look good on paper, but in fact, this is what China still needs, and we're building globally competitive industries?
Right. The first thing that I would point out is there's this misperception in China that what makes China different from every other country that went through this process is this desire to double down on the high-tech sector of the economy, the sexy parts of the economy. Of course, it's not true. A well-known Chinese economist made, I won't mention his name because I think his statement was very foolish, but he said the big difference between Japan in the 80s and 90s and China today is that we are a high-tech leader and Japan wasn't. Japan didn't double down on the high-tech sector. Now, anyone who lived through that period will find that, absurd. In the 1990s, all the really cool technology products seemed to come out of Japan. What's more, in the 1960s, people forget this, but there was a time when Russia was growing, the Soviet Union was growing so quickly that most people believed, and from President Kennedy down to Paul Samuelson, who said it in his 1961 textbook, that the Soviet Union would overtake the US both economically and technologically in the 1980s because it was so technologically advanced. It was growing very quickly, technologically advanced. The Russians were as good at computers as the US as late as the late 1960s. They were ahead of the US in many areas, including space and satellite technology. And the Soviets bet very heavily that because of the difficulties, there were huge debates domestically about the need to restructure the economy. Because of the political difficulties of doing so, they would solve the problem with technology. It's an old argument. Many countries have tried it, but there are several problems with it. One is that technology is a small part of the economy. Now, it's true that technology can increase productivity, but if you look at even things like the spread of electricity in the United States in the 1920s, I think in 1920, 1% of American factories were electrified. By 1930, all of them were electrified. That created a huge boost in American productivity, but not nearly enough for what China needs to be able to rebalance with high growth rates. We need truly earth-shattering improvements in productivity. And I'm not sure that we can necessarily count on it. It could happen. The steam technology had a huge impact on British productivity. But even then, you look at British productivity growth was like around 2%. We need something truly extraordinary. The second point that I would make is technology doesn't make you rich. Commercially sustainable technology makes you rich. So if I spend $100 to produce some brilliant technology that creates $90 worth of value for my economy, I'm not richer. I've got great technology and maybe I'll get a Nobel Prize, but I'm not richer. I'm actually poorer. And so one of the big questions in China is not, are they technologically advanced? They clearly are. The problem is whether that technology is commercially sustainable. We always hear it's not now, everyone's losing money, but it will be in the future. All bad investments are expected to be profitable in the future. Some are, some aren't. We don't really know. But I would say that that huge bet on technology as a way of avoiding the very difficult institutional adjustments has been made before. It doesn't have a very successful history, but that doesn't mean it can't happen in the future. I would just say I would want another arrow in my quiver.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Pettis. Now I really hate my role as a chair because I have to cut off this fantastic, dynamic, and excellent discussion between Professor and all our great audiences. So I guess, a couple of takeaway message for me. I'm pretty sure everybody has a great reflection on what Professor Pettis has discussed. For me, it's the very challenging task for China to rebalance its economic structure, which may take a quite long time to materialize. But on the other hand, it's slightly exciting to hear Professor Pettis saying that the government is seriously considering the big fiscal stimulus, which is badly demanded for many of us who have suffered such a long time in China's stock market. Okay, so before I draw a conclusion to this keynote speech, let me remind everybody, from today until Friday, we're going to have over a dozen of equally excellent event and talks and speeches. So please join us on for this China Week, and look forward to seeing many of you again there. And finally, please join me again to give a big round of applauding to Professor Michael Pettis.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.